So this was right off our island, and the main reason I actually got a wildlife lens, a long reach lens, was because we have orca, and I wanted those shots. They come around 4 or 5 times a year that I'll catch. They're around a lot more than that. And sometimes they're specks on the water that you can barely see, and sometimes they come in close, and it's absolutely magical. This was kind of mid-range, and actually these shots were caught by my husband using the backup camera. I didn't manage to get these shots, which is why it's a numbers game. And when you have more than one enthusiast in the family, it doubles your chances of getting the shots that are really amazing. So some days, wildlife photography looks like a walk in the park, right? It's serene. You get some dappled shadows. You can get animals that really look like they're just chilling out. Also my husband's shot, by the way. Sometimes you get some attitude, which is always fun, especially the juvenile birds. These juvenile cedar waxwings have more attitude than you could ever expect out of a little bird. And sometimes you manage to just nail it, right? You get that perfect freeze shot. And that's always a super exciting moment. But sometimes, just sometimes, you're lucky enough to come across an amazing moment. And you're so excited, and you're taking lots of pictures, and you're sure that you got this death-defying fight as hawks tumble to the ground. And you are stoked. And then you get home, and you realize you absolutely did not get the shot. So we're going to call this session Mission Impossible, Time to Get Wild. The first thing we have to figure out is how to overcome the forces that are out to get us. Let's start with backgrounds. Are they a friend or are they a foe? Well, we all know that answer is mixed. It's a little bit of both, depending on what they're doing. For instance, this was on the same day that I had the 3-hawk death-defying fight, which I suspect was a mating ritual and competition for mating. I've actually gotten a chance to see 2 hawks lock talons and drop to the ground in front of me. It was actually in my backyard while I was on a conference call with clients. And so my wonderful husband grabbed the camera and went out and caught a really beautiful series of pictures of it. But in this case, this background, super distracting. Even if the birds were in focus, the background would make it very hard to see the action as it unfolds. In some cases, the background is just part and parcel of the environment that the animal is in, and actually gives you a chance to see how well they blend in and why they have the coloring that they have. So in this case, these rocks are a great home for our little ground squirrel. However, they are a little distracting, so you have to look a little harder to see the animal. That might be the effect you want, it might not be. Same thing with this juvenile white-crowned sparrow. You can tell it's a juvenile because the stripe on the head is red and not black. It's in its native environment. It blends in beautifully, but that background is super busy, and it doesn't really let the bird shine. So ultimately what you want is a background that is going to complement your subject. And a lot of times the way that you get that is that you have a shallow depth of field, which means your aperture is set fairly low, and that your background elements are far enough back that they blur out and they become much more a part of the background. So in a case like this, you get a sense of the environment that the hummingbird is in, which is lovely. These are Costa's hummingbirds, by the way, which you only have in a very small part of the United States, and you guys are really lucky to have them here. This little corner of Utah, a little sliver of Arizona, tiny bit of Southern California, and mostly in Mexico is where you can find these birds. But they're everywhere here, breeding and showing off their beautiful purple gorgets. The males are really showy and beautiful birds. And in fact, one of the cool things about this bird is that there's not a lot of pictures of them. So this picture, in contrast, had a wall behind it, but it blended out completely. You don't even see the bricks because it was far enough back. And when you get a nice clean background like this, it really allows you to show off the bird. And Audubon, I had submitted this photo to their contest, and I didn't win, but this bird, this photo is actually being used as the marquee hero image on their online field guide for this particular species of bird. which is really exciting. It's a huge compliment for them to think that this was a beautiful representation of this bird. And they did choose, one that had a simpler background so that the bird itself was the star of the show. Here's another case where we had a gray whale around our island for about a month, which was really rare. It gave me lots of opportunities to photograph these whales. And the heart-shaped blow that they make happens because they have 2 blowholes. So when they breathe out, if you're at the right angle, their first part of their blow looks like a heart. And in this case, you see it in its environment. You can see the shore in the background, which works out to be lovely. But here's what happens when you get a more simple background. So because I just had the water and it was faded back and it was just adding ambiance to the shot, it really allowed this heart to pop out and even get the reflection on the water. So the real focus of this photo in comparison is the whale with the heart-shaped blow, and it's a very clean photo, which works a little better for framing, for photo contests, for other sorts of applications. So backgrounds, friend and foe, depends on how you're using them and what kind of atmosphere you're looking to get. But they're always something that you should be aware of, whether you want to clear your background or whether you want to use your background to make it part of the story you're telling. That background is something you got to be thinking about. Next up is foregrounds, because they are going to block you at every turn. When you're trying to take pictures of wildlife, they're trying to play coy and peekaboo with you at all times because they don't want to be seen. So inevitably, you're going to have twigs and leaves and branches and grass and everything you can imagine between you and the wildlife you want to shoot. The shots you end up keeping are the ones where you manage to get focus on a little bitty bird as it is in a whole mound of bare branches or leaves that are causing shadows. And so they add depth, right? They're part of what makes the shot interesting, but to get the focus and not have that focus lock on the branches in front of you or the foreground in front of you is tough. So it's a game of peekaboo, and it's you against everything between you and the wildlife that you have to learn how to master. And focus points help with that a lot. And then you got to outsmart the sun, especially here, right? You guys know this pain. So you can have a setup that's okay, and you can see that it's sort of dark in some spots and a little too light in others. But if you just walk around a little bit so that the sun is more behind you than to the sides or in front of you, you start to get a different picture. And this was at the community center. I think Larry was finishing up some sort of class, and I was out there with my camera looking for opportunities. House finches, really good for being willing to be photographed. So it's a good example of just where the sun's coming from and what kind of shot you end up getting. My rule, if I can be cognizant of it, is always to try to set myself up to have the sun behind me, or at least in the arc that is somewhere, maybe to the sides, the back sides. If it's coming in at a side angle, you may get lucky. If it's coming from behind, you're looking for a very different kind of shot. Same thing here. So this is another Costa's male hummingbird with light that's coming straight down, so probably very middle of the day. And then this is a guy that I was shooting later in the evening with the sun behind me and just perfect light, right? And it makes such a difference in even, particularly with hummingbirds, what kind of detail you can catch. Every now and then, being backlit works for you, right? This has a very specific mood to it. And why did the coyote cross the road? So, it can make a difference. You can use the sun for some really great silhouetting, but it is something to be aware of. If you can get it behind you, if you can start with your positioning when you're trying to do wildlife shots, knowing that the sun is behind you, you're going to have a better chance of getting a more evenly lit shot. First few hours of the day are great. I don't usually see them. The last few hours of the day are great. I get more of those. A lot of times I'm shooting in the middle of the day, which is actually when wildlife is the quietest anyway. So I don't recommend it, but it happens to be when I have time for it. But you'll get much better light. Evening light can be magical. Morning light can be magical. And the difference between light at that hour and the softness of it can just make the difference in a photograph. So, if you're a morning person, get out there with your camera before 10 and take pictures. I think you'll be really surprised at how the results turn out immediately. Then you got to master the shadows. So you guys don't have a lot of low light problems, but maybe you visit places that have low light. And when you have low light, standard settings don't cut it anymore. This is a person fire spinning, but the only way you get a shot like this is if you're cranking down your shutter speed and you're holding very, very still. Similar to fireworks settings. You want to be able to make sure that if you want those trailers, your shutter speed has to be down. And this starts to get into the land of being willing to manually set your settings instead of relying on it being automatic. Same thing here. I actually had to set up on a tripod and let this little one peek out of the hole at the very last bit of light that we had in Austin, Texas. But I got the shot and it was amazing. I was really excited about it. And then sometimes you're just hiking and you're hand holding and you've got to be able to get your shutter speed down from your high standard wildlife setting to something low enough that you'll actually get the shot and still be able to have that level of clarity. Now, if he was moving, we would have had a problem. Thankfully, he was frozen, so we were good. And same thing here. We had baby barred owls in the trees, and I was in full shadow. There was no way I was getting this shot if I wasn't going to adjust down and account for the fact that I had very little light to work with. And we're going to talk about what can you do when you're in low light. There's a few different settings that you can adjust. So it's not impossible. It is definitely possible to get these shots. Again, you're still going to fail sometimes, but let's talk about things you can do just at a general level that'll get you there. One of the things you can do to get a great wildlife shot is to use scale. And that actually works really well when you don't have a super zoom lens. That's a bird with a 10-foot wingspan. And when you know that California condor has a 10-foot wingspan, it puts Zion's cliffs into perspective at just how immense they are. And again, that background is soft enough and different enough from the bird that it works. I think scale is a really cool thing to be able to get. I usually, if I'm shooting really close in, I'm trying to see if it's a very small bird. I've actually had the thorns on pokey plants be so huge, right? Like a little ruby-crowned kinglet next to a thorny plant where the thorn is as big as its feet. And you're like, wow, that's a very small bird. Offering things that have scale really can bring a lot to that photograph. So if you don't have a super zoomy lens, look for shots like this, right? Wildlife can be found and can be photographed at a distance where you're getting a lot of the environment, where you're getting a lot of the ambiance of where they are and what's around them in the moment. The other thing you're going to do is catch them on the move. Stationary shots are fun, and it's a good place to start because an animal sitting still is a lot easier than an animal that's moving. So you start with a lot of that, but as you get better at your settings, as you get better at getting the camera up and getting focused, you start to get to where the shots that are in motion really tell a different story. And as I've entered contests, as I've put photos in front of people, as I've done talks like this, the biggest reaction, the most emotion comes from photos like the one on the left, the one that has more movement to it, that really tells a story rather than something that's posed or feels like it's posed. Bunnies, they're great. Bunny eating your plants might not be what you want to see, but is a much more compelling picture. And then you got to decide, are you going to look at the big picture or are you going to focus in on something much smaller? So Tonnequint Park offers you lots of opportunities to get the chaos, right? And so that mallard was in focus, but surrounded by all of his friends doing their thing. And then this one was just on her own and filled my frame and happened to be, drinking and getting that spout from her bill at just the right angle. And they're two very different pictures, right? You're looking at the bigger picture with everything around them, or you're focusing in on an individual. Both are great. And again, if you don't have a big zoomy lens, you're looking for what do I put in this frame where I've got a more broad story that I can tell. Perspective's everything, right? Changes how we see everything. So this was along the Santa Clara Trail, and it was nesting season. So it was about this time of year, or actually this might have been when we were here in February. And this little kestrel was super mad at this red-tailed hawk because it was near its nest. And I find it hard to imagine the size of birds, especially when I'm seeing them in flight, especially birds of prey. And red-tailed hawks are big birds, and kestrels are little tiny birds, but rarely do you get to see the size differential together. So the perspective of this little tiny bird chasing off this big beast of a hawk is pretty great. It was overcast, and I had to do a lot of work post-production to bring up the levels so that this turned into a good shot. But I kept it because it tells a story. It's a perspective that you don't always get to see. And then sometimes you got to shake up the perspective, right? Everyone knows what the swan doing the typical swimming pose is. But when you get a chance to get this close and they're staring you down like that, it's fun to get the water droplets. It's fun to get the pattern of the feathers. So one thing you can look for always is how do you get a shot that isn't the typical shot, right? It's fun to get the classic pose, but it's also really fun to look for opportunities that not everybody gets to see. And my number one takeaway is always that you never forget that they each have a story. And that's always what I'm trying to capture. In addition to photographing, I started a naturalist blog where I decided I had too much story to tell. So I took a lot of my various encounters and took my photography and added the narrative of what was happening during that particular episode. And so I have a lot of passion for telling the story of what was going on in these wildlife encounters, because it's never just you're taking a picture. There's always something going on. And there's a lot to be said, right? Even if it's just a single picture that you don't explain, some of them just want to tell their own story. I have to tell you, so this was on Peggy's back wall at her house, and this little male house finch was dancing back and forth in front of this female who was looking anywhere but at him. He was trying so hard to impress her. And I have probably 30 shots of him like hopping and dancing and putting his wings out and looking at her with just complete adoration. And she was just like, oh. He didn't get lucky, unfortunately. I don't think. I didn't see it anyway. But to watch that courtship dance was amazing. And what I found as I looked through these pictures, I loved the series, but there were a handful of shots in there that just stood out all by themselves as telling the story, just on their own. This was also at Tanaquint Park, and I have no idea who this beetle is, but he is king of the world, isn't he? Like he's telling everybody that this is his place, and he's going to be master of it. I love it, and I don't know why it makes me giggle every time I see it, but it really does. It's a very evil sprout on that tree. So this is a baby Costa's hummingbird, and this week we were really lucky to notice that I was working, and my husband comes out and he says, "I think there's a baby in the tree." Okay, so we grabbed the camera, and for 3 days, so hummingbird babies grow up really fast. They probably spend under 3 weeks, closer to 2 weeks from hatching to leaving the nest. And then when they fledge, there's a few days where they can't fly very far, right? But it's like 2 or 3. Lots of other birds are more like you got a week, you got maybe 10 days that they're going to be in the area. This little baby, we must have caught it on its first day out of the nest because it was still just barely branching, like not able to get around very well at all. So we spent 3 days just completely enamored of this little baby hummingbird doing its thing. It was licking branches. It was rubbing its face all over branches. It was saying things to all the new growth. It was looking around. Like, it was endless fun. And I spent a lot of time enjoying that. And even just seeing its wing development, right? Like those little wings are not ready. they're still waiting to fill out so they can actually do what hummingbirds do. So yeah, you catch those moments, and that's when you feel really victorious. So one of the ways you can do this is go find the action. Go be where the action is. Back to Tonnequint Park. Always something going on. If you want a local spot to go bird, you're gonna find something to photograph there, whether it's at the pond or even just walking through the woods. There's so many birds and so many things to see. And it's never the same twice when we go, which I really appreciate. Being from out of town, I'm always looking for species I haven't seen before. And Tonnequint Park has definitely given me that. I finally got to see an Abert's towhee. We've got spotted towhees at home, but we don't have Aberts. And other adventures. So you can find local hotspots. And when things are hotspots, it means your opportunity to capture wildlife goes up exponentially because they're there, right? You go where they are. This is on my island, and there's a little park that has a little stream of water that goes from one lake to another. And it's a pretty happening spot some days. The robins and the house finches and chickadees and juncos all love to go take baths in this spot. So if I want to go, catch some birds, splish splashing, it's a good spot. And there's a few spots on my island that have great birding and wildlife opportunities. So we hit those a lot. If you're not going to go to them, you got to get them to come to you, right? And I was here at right about the time that the community said no more bird feeders. And we were all like, what? So the hummingbirds won in that gamble, right? Like they totally won in spades getting to keep their feeders up. But one of the things that I got Peggy was these wicker balls that you can put raw cotton in that the birds can use for nesting. So it's not leaving detritus anywhere, but in the spring, it's an amazing opportunity for birds to come and get nesting material. And lots of birds come and get the nesting material, even the hummingbirds. So that's one way. If you want to just put something in your backyard that attracts birds, that's going to be a hit in the spring for sure. Another thing you can do is put up trail cameras to figure out who's around and what are they doing and when are they there. It's kind of a different kind of surveillance, but it gives you a really good idea, and sometimes you get a surprise. This was in Austin where we were staying this spring, and I didn't expect this little screech owl to be taking a bath in the bird bath. It also speaks to the fact that water features are obviously something that draw animals of all sorts. It's just so stinking cute. And super nervous because, you never know what's going to eat you when you're taking a bath. The other thing is you always want to be on the lookout, right? Wildlife photography is about observation first and foremost. You're not going to be able to take the pictures if you haven't taken the time to tune in to paying attention to the cues that are around you. So this shot, I wasn't expecting at all. I've never managed to see a hummingbird on a nest. And I was sitting in the guest bedroom talking to my sister on the phone, and I noticed a little female Costa's hummingbird in the branches and then hovering all around the bushes and just spending a lot of time about this level to the ground in the immediate area. And I was like, what are you doing? There's no flowers, there's no feeders, like what's going on? And then I saw her tuck herself into this little tiny nest that was in the rose bush that was right next to my bedroom window. I would never have known that was there. It was so well tucked away and so well hidden. But because I was there, because I was paying attention, because I was curious, like, what are you doing here? Why are you fluttering around for no obvious reason? And nest building season and baby feeding season, so, late spring, early summer is a great time to find wildlife, birds in particular, because they're often, ferrying food back and forth. So you get lots of opportunity to see them and then kind of follow the pattern of where they're going.
Another moment too. So this is at our favorite beach on the island. There's a little spit that goes out into the Puget Sound, and we spend a lot of time there sitting on the picnic table, drinking a beer and watching the world. And normally you don't see deer, much less a brand spanking new fawn with all of its spots. We were probably facing the water at this point, and it was just happenstance that, you know, we looked back around us because this was happening on the spit behind us, and noticed Mama walking across with her baby. So of course we spun that direction and started facing them and just watched them walk across the spit. We were far enough away that Mom couldn't care less about us. And so she led her baby across the spit, and the baby sat down in a little patch of grass while Mom went and grazed and like napped for a little while. And it was just amazing. But it could so easily have been that we were paying attention to something else and she would have just walked behind us and we never would have seen. And a lot of wildlife opportunities happen that way. It's another reason why if you've got a buddy that'll go with you, it's immensely helpful. 2 pairs of eyes, 3 pairs of eyes, 4 pairs of eyes are going to catch a lot more than just one person. So I'm always grateful to have someone with me that is equally excited about keeping their eyes open and observing what's going on around us. Another thing is picking the right time to see the action. Every season has different wildlife opportunities. In the spring, you get a lot of nest building. And at the point at which I saw this mourning dove duck herself into a gutter, I was like, well, that's not your best choice. But clearly, you're going to be back and forth out of that gutter a lot. No, I can't imagine that ended particularly well. And then again, that mama with the baby, we watched lots of feedings because it was the season for it. In later midsummer and into later summer, you've got a whole lot of juvenile birds that are not savvy yet. They're not wary of people. They don't really know what they're doing yet. They're a little awkward. And those are great photo opportunities because they do all sorts of goofy things, and they'll tolerate your proximity a lot better than adults will because they don't know to run yet. So that's what I love about midsummer and late summer. In the fall, you start getting into, leaves dropping so you can actually see in the trees again. That's useful where I live. And so every season, you kind of have to figure out what is it about that season that draws the wildlife. But it's definitely possible in every season to have, kind of go-to places or go-to behaviors that you're looking for. The other thing you want to do in our Mission Impossible is to disappear. If the birds can't see you or if they don't perceive you, they're not going to be worried about you. So your windows are a great way to disappear. Unfortunately, it means your post-production is a little bit harder because shooting photos through a window means you've got to do a little more work to make the color right and to make the clarity better. So you could probably have a whole post-production session on just that. How do you salvage photos through windows? But wildlife doesn't pay attention to you if you're in that zone. Same thing sometimes on your patio. If you're on a covered patio, wildlife is doing its thing and they're not really looking at you if you're still. That's why bird blinds are a thing, is you're tucked out of sight and the birds don't have to be afraid of you. The other place that's really great is your car. Your car with the windows open, driving slowly, especially those of you with electric cars. There's the possibility of getting shots you would never have been able to get anywhere else because you've got, a beanbag and you're in your car. Hopefully you're the passenger. If you're driver, hopefully you're stopped. This coyote pup, he was probably 3 or 4 months old, was walking into one of our parks on the island. And, because I was in the car, he was pretty oblivious to me. And I got closer shots than I ever would have been able to if he had known that I was there. So look for opportunities to camouflage yourself, right? To not be there. Put on your cloak of invisibility. So with that, and sometimes it's very elegant, the positions you have to get into to get the shot. I do a lot of crawling around on the ground. So now it's really about the technology and your settings and all of that to get those kinds of shots. Before I dive into that, any questions, any thoughts? All right. So what's the easy answer to taking pictures of wildlife? Anybody know? There is one. There's some trade-offs. That sports mode setting that a lot of cameras have is going to get you 85% of the way there. It is specifically designed to capture things in motion. The same settings that work for capturing someone kicking a ball across a soccer field are going to be the same settings that'll help you get the road runner who's zipping by. Same kind of reflexes too. So the sports mode setting is a great place to start if you don't want to fiddle around with settings. You're going to reliably get pretty good pictures with that as your default. If you're intimidated, if you're just starting, if you don't really want to fiddle around with things, you're going to get a pretty good compilation of settings with that. Usually it'll put the drive into either continuous or burst mode on your camera, which allows you, instead of taking a single picture, to take a series of pictures if you keep your finger down. That's the cheaty way to get the series. Most of the time, sports mode is going to disable your flash, so your camera's not trying to trigger a flash, which slows you down. And it'll put your autofocus on AI servo, which instead of keeping your focus on a single point, as you move your camera, it will continue to refocus. So your camera is doing everything it can to help you track something that is moving if you're in sports mode. The disadvantage is that you're still at the mercy of the camera to choose that right shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, which is the magic triangle of how you get the perfect shot. So that triangle, it's really intimidating. And I'll tell you, when I first started, I played with some settings, and what really helped me was to go to flickr.com, where I was uploading my pictures, add some professional photographers to my feed and look at their settings. Every time I saw a photo that I was blown away by, I was digging into their metadata so that I could see what was their shutter speed, what was their aperture, what was their ISO, how were they getting this shot. And it really gave me a little bit of insight into what the sweet spots were to get those kinds of shots. And it's where you really have to kind of resign yourself to, if you're going to get too far into wildlife photography, you have to get comfortable with changing your settings. And that can be really intimidating, especially if you're reacting, right? You're in a moment where you gotta be able to do things in a split second. So that's where the practice comes in, is you start with settings that are going to work for you, and then you play with them as conditions change. So what is aperture? Anybody? It's your depth of field. What does it do?
It either lets more light in or decreases the light.
Right, and light, remember, it's our friend or our foe. So aperture is how much light enters the camera, and the way we measure it is our f-stops. It's the shorthand for that focal length and how the aperture is measured. So these are f-stops that you'll sometimes see on a camera, depending on your lens, depending on your body, right? All of this is variable. But when it comes to aperture in general, the larger the aperture, the smaller the number, which is completely inverse and very confusing. But if you look at this range, the smaller numbers are on the right. That also correlates with how much light is allowed in, right? So if you're over here on this end, that hole is really big and your camera's getting a lot of light. And if you're over here on this end, this hole is really small and you're not getting much light in. And what that does for your depth of field is, if you're getting lots of light in your camera, you're getting a very shallow depth of field, which means if you and I are very close together, like someone's just behind me, the camera might still just catch me in focus and put them a little bit out of focus, right? It's why something in the middle of a field is in focus and everything else behind it in front of it is blurred. That's a shallow depth of field. A very wide depth of field is what you want when you do landscape photography, generally speaking. You want to be able to get the flowers in the foreground and the mountains in the background and have everything be in focus. So some of that magic of getting that soft background or the soft foreground is that you've got a shallower depth of field that you're working with. The problem with shallow depth of field is that for wildlife, you kind of have to find that sweet spot. I tend to shoot between 5, 6, and 8. And the reason for that is a few things. First of all, each lens has a different sweet spot. My Tamron 150 to 600 tends to like 8. It's a very happy setting. It tends to be sharpest there. If I go lower, if I go higher, my sharpness of image degrades just a little. But the other thing is it really gets you that midline of depth of field. So if a bird is all the way across the room from me, my depth of field doesn't matter as much because it's further away. If the bird is 4 feet away and I can barely shoot it with my lens because things have to be very far away, if my depth of field is too shallow, the eyeball is going to be in focus, but the wing isn't. So the closer the bird is, the more your depth of field matters. And I mean, sometimes artistically, you want that eye to be in focus and everything else to be blurred, right? But a lot of times you want the whole bird in focus. That's why I go with f8 a lot. Most of the time that gets me the happy medium of birds that are close still being all in focus. Light, though, when you're losing light, you want that f-stop to be lower because you want more light in your camera. That is going to mean that your depth of field is going to get more shallow, but if they're far away, if they're flying, that doesn't matter really much at all. So those are my general settings for aperture for wildlife. Sometimes I go higher. My Tamron won't go lower than 5.6. So that's my minimum. Well, if I'm not zoomed in, if I'm at 150, it'll go to 4.5. But when you've got 600 millimeters, you use it. Unless there's a whale directly in front of you and you're trying to fit the whole thing in the frame and you still can't, which, you at that moment you realize your zoom lens failed you. I actually had to bust out my iPhone on a whaling trip because the humpback came so close that I couldn't use my big zoomy lens. I was imagining breaching whale in the distance that I was going to get amazing shots of, and instead we had a juvenile humpback that was rubbing itself against the back of the boat. First world problems. All right, shutter speed. It's how long the shutter is open, and it's measured by tenths of a second. So these are settings that you would see more typically on the faster end. If you get below that, then what you get into is more slow shutter speed. A lot of times you need to be on a tripod because if the camera moves, then everything is going to blur. At the left end, you've got longer shutter speeds. At the right end, you've got shorter. Typically, you don't hear people say 1/800th. You just hear people say a shutter speed of 800. Because very few people are shooting in the slow side, especially for wildlife photography. Shutter speed also matters when it comes to light, right? The longer the shutter is open, the more light you've got coming in. So that's also a trade-off. If you're shooting at 2000, you might be getting that bird flying much more, much crisper. But if you're in low light, it's going to be a super dark photo. So there's a trade-off there as far as where the sweet spot is for the settings. And crispness of motion is going to depend on what that shutter speed is. At 30, it's going to be pretty blurry if something's moving. At 2000, it's going to be really sharp if something is moving. For wildlife, I typically end up between 640 and 200. My go-to is 800. If I've got more light, I'm happy to crank it up, but 800 rarely fails me. Action shots do need a lot of light, so the higher you can get that shutter speed up, the better chance of getting a crisp shot you're going to have. And that's the thing about being prepared for motion. And I've done this to myself because I was shooting in low light and cranked down my shutter speed to 500, 400, 320. And then the next day I had to grab my camera to get something that was moving fast, and the whole thing was just a blur because I needed it to be at 800 or 1000 or 1250 to really be able to get that shot. So that's something, my default is always to leave my camera set to what would let me get something moving at high speed, and then I adjust down from there if I have to. All right, ISO. It's another setting that we use to control light, right? So this is the third part of the triangle. And I had a really hard time wrapping my brain around ISO, especially because of the way that the numbers are. And then someone explained it to me. If you think of it as bees that are light helpers, if you've got a swarm of 100 versus a swarm of 6400, you're getting more help in getting light with the 6400. So the lower the ISO, the lower the number, the lower the ISO. What that gives you is when your ISO is cranked way down, it's giving you minimal light. It's not opening it up more for you. When it's cranked up, you're getting lots more light, and different cameras have different upper thresholds. The trade-off, though, is you get noise. So at very low ISO, you're going to have a very clear picture. When you get up to the really high ISOs, you start to get more and more noise in your photo. So those speckles, those bits of color in there that start to stand out. And you've got to do a lot of work in post-production to try to account for that. Higher level cameras are going to give you more before that starts to happen. So more of a range that allows you to get up to a higher ISO. For wildlife, I try to keep it under 800. That doesn't always happen. Here, you might actually be able to because of how much sunlight you have. Where I am, it's a gift to have 800. It's what gets you if it's what gets you the shot, then doing it is it's a really important piece of the puzzle. So if you've got limited light in one way or another, cranking up the ISO means that you're going to get enough light in the camera that you'll actually get the shot. If you have to clean it up in post-production, that's not the end of the world. The tools have gotten really good for that. However, if you want to print it, if you want to sell it as stock art on any website, if you want to enter it into a contest, you're probably going to want to keep that ISO down, ideally under 1600. And so you've got to figure out how to adjust other settings to keep it down if that's a priority for you. If you're sharing it digitally, you've got a lot of leeway on how the ISO can be. So we've got those three: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Oh my. So if a crow is chasing a red-tailed hawk and you have a front row seat, what are your settings? Let's say it's an f8. You've got your shutter speed at 1600 and you've got your ISO cranked up because you don't want to miss the shot. How come our ISO is so high? Probably because it's cloudy, it's late in the day, you're dealing with some sort of low light. What's the first thing you can adjust to get a good shot without compromising too much? Your f-stop is the first thing. Why, though? Why would your f-stop be the first thing you can change? But why f-stop over something else?
Because if you change your speed, you might get a blurry photo.
And they're farther away from you. This bird isn't close. It's a chase scene further out. So your f-stop, your depth of field doesn't matter as much as it would if it was close. So when you've got that mega chase scene going on, dropping your f-stop to get more light is going to be an easy choice. It's not gonna alter your end result much at all. Unless they're flying through trees and brush and your focus starts catching background, and then it's going to be blurry, but there's nothing you can do about that. And what's the other thing you can adjust?
Well, you could slow your speed down.
Yeah, you can drop that shutter speed. Sometimes it'll work in your favor. Sometimes your shots are going to get blurry. Sometimes it becomes artistic. So, every now and then you get that shot that the body is actually pretty clear, but the wings have some blur to them, which can add a feeling of motion to the photo. But yeah, that's kind of how the settings work. So this is my go-to table for kind of settings I would prefer in different situations for wildlife. I have varied from this, but these are kind of the ideal if I can pick and choose in any given situation. Stationary versus in motion, and then wildlife in the distance versus low light, cloudy, or late in the day. Almost all the time, I will keep my ISO on auto. If I have to, I will start playing with the ISO, but I gotta tell you, out of all the settings, on a Canon anyway, I can adjust the shutter speed and the depth of field, the aperture, each with a dial. So that's really easy to change back. ISO, I have to hit a button and then turn a dial. And inevitably, I will crank the ISO up, and then the next thing I shoot has bright light on it, and
it's all blown out and you can't see any detail. And so it's gotten me so many times. I try really hard to not mess with my ISO because I forget to change it back, and then I'm lamenting bad shots further in the future.
Where did you get that tail?
Oh, I made it up. Yeah, that was just, based on me sitting down and thinking about what do I use in different situations. And this... Oh, by all means, yeah. And actually, I mean, if you guys want a PDF of all of these pages that actually have content on them, I'll send over a black and white PDF that Larry can distribute.
Put them on the website.
Perfect.
Anybody can get them.
Cool. Yeah, I'll send that over so that you guys have this and you don't have to scribble a million notes. I didn't come to this quickly, right? This was me playing with settings over time and getting comfortable with each situation. And that's kind of how you have to do it. Like, for 6 months, I might be focusing on how do I get low light, because that's all I've got, right? I am in low light land in the Pacific Northwest in the winter, or overcast skies in Texas, and I'm trying to figure out how to get the shot. So that's how I would recommend, like if you're starting, focus on stationary wildlife and get comfortable with your settings there. Or birds in motion, and get comfortable with your settings there. And then figure out what needs to change for differing situations. Other questions? Other tips, right? What do you guys do to get the shot? Is there something else that you adjust? It's a pretty good table. I've come back to it a few times.
What about lens flare? Do you ever use a hood?
I've always got my hood on. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that hood is, well, it helps too because the lens is so long that keeping the lens protected when it's, down here on me and I'm walking through, tall grass or whatever, it's important. So yeah, I always use a hood if I'm outside shooting with the long lens for sure. All right, so control of focus. How's that one? I spent a lot of times in my early shooting of wildlife getting the leaf next to the bird or getting the tree branch that was, 2 feet away from the bird. And it was super frustrating. And what I came to is instead of using autofocus and letting the focus points do whatever they wanted, I picked my focus point. And because of the way you end up doing post-production, most of the time you don't want your bird or wildlife in the very center of your picture. Most of the time you want them offset just a little. So by choosing the center point as my focus point on my camera, what I end up doing is I'm always looking to put my target in the center, and that's always where I'm trying to point my camera. And then when I'm editing, I'm usually pulling in from one side or another to get that perfect 3/4 or thirds offset that you do to try and get the better framing of a shot in post-production. And then I can always rely on the fact that the animal is where I want it to be, right? That center point is always what I'm shooting for. It's a little frustrating if I'm shooting flowers or something else. I have to make sure I change that setting because sometimes you really want the whole picture, but you want the focus off to the side. I haven't used autofocus settings in a really long time because I really, most of the time, need to reliably be able to get my focus where I want it to be. You could pick any point, right? It doesn't matter which point as long as there's a point or a cluster of points that are where you would put as your target. Yep.
As I say, do you use a single point or do you use a cluster? It depends what you're doing.
I want to say with my new camera, I use a cluster. I didn't really have that option with older cameras, so it was a single point. But I think the cluster, it's probably what I'm doing now. I haven't looked in a while. And every camera is different, right? These are all settings you guys are going to have to look up because everybody's camera is going to do it a little bit differently and have different capabilities in what they can do. And then, as I mentioned before, that autofocus mode, that AI servo, keeps shifting your focus point as you have your button half pressed. So it lets you constantly refocus on something that's moving instead of holding a static focus, which is really important when something's moving around on you.
Is that the same thing as continuous focus? Is that what you're talking about?
Probably, yeah. It's probably called that in other cameras.
Do you find that when you use the cluster focus, though, that typically you want just the eye to be the sharpest point, and when you use a cluster, sometimes it might pick up the tip of a wing or
Depends on how
the
far
bottom of
away
the
it is.
breast
Yeah.
or-
Yeah, so there's pros and cons, right? That single focus point is laser sharp. And if you've got it pointed at the right spot, you're in a good shape. If it's not pointed at the right spot, then you've missed the chance. So depending on how good you are at nailing where you want that point to be, single point can be a blessing or a curse. I have definitely wanted to get the eye and ended up getting the tail or the wing. And so cluster focus is just a little more forgiving, but also a little more distracting.
So also going to depend on
Distance.
how far away you
Yeah,
are.
for sure. Very much
Whether
so.
it's moving, if it's static, single point is great.
Yeah.
But if it's moving, then you want a wider.
It helps. It very much helps. Yeah. Yeah. So there's trade-offs, and I would play with both, see what works for you. And, you know, don't be afraid to play with your settings because as we've said again and again, you're going to miss some shots. It's just part of the game of wildlife. But it's always a learning opportunity to see what you end up getting. And sometimes you surprise yourself. Some of these settings I happened upon because I changed it because I thought, what the heck? And then it turned out to be a way better setting for what I needed.
Can I ask a question about, being a member of the Audubon Society? Can you use their images then?
No. Typically, well, it depends, right? For something like this, I could pull a bird picture off the Audubon website and give them credit on it, and they would consider that fair use, okay use, because I'm not trying to profit from it. I'm not trying to use it for my own end means. But generally speaking, and this is really important, anytime you see anyone's photograph out there, just because it's on the internet doesn't mean you have permission to use it. And I'm sure you guys have been through this a lot. I deal with this with a lot of folks because I'm in the graphic design field. Plenty of people don't know that like everything, you've got ownership of your photography by default. Now you can put a lot of my photography that I have out on Flickr, I've put out as a certain kind of Creative Commons license where I've said if you're using it for personal use or nonprofit use, you can use it as long as you give me credit. And so I've had people who write blogs, who are doing nature or wildlife articles, contact me and say, I would love to use your photo in this context. Do I have your permission? And I always give permission because I want people to use them and enjoy using them. And when I submit anything to Audubon's contest, I am giving them permission to use my photos for their work. So just be really careful. I think if you're in a context like this, it's fine. I think if you're going to share anything out on social media, it's really important to always credit back to whoever the original photo is. And if you can link to their profile or link to their website, that's really important as well. Just for credit's sake.
Well, I'm a painter and I shoot, my
Yeah.
stuff usually until
Yeah.
I am a little bit more lame now, but anyway, can you recommend a site?
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you my Flickr account that probably has 10,000 photos in it. So you're welcome to go paint anything in there. I'll pull it up at the end so that you guys can have the URL for that. Yeah, and a lot of folks will let you do that. Flickr.com is a great place, especially if you do a search for just anyone who has a Creative Commons license on their photography. Most of the time, if you're doing it for use like that, people are perfectly happy to let you use it as reference. And I run into that a lot in our community. I live on an island where, most of the folks are retired and there's a lot of artists and painters. And it's been amazing to have some of my photographs that I've put out in social media. People have come and asked, can I paint it? And I'm like, please, that would be so cool. And then just to see what they do with it is also amazing. It's really fun. All right, let's talk about drive. It's how your shutter is engaged. Are you taking a single shot, continuous, or timer delayed, right? So I've referred to this a few times. So it's often called burst mode. It can also be called continuous shooting mode. If you have this setting on your camera, you want to use it for wildlife because it's all a numbers game. The more pictures you take, the more of a chance you're gonna get the shot. Some cameras have, 2 to 3 frames per second. Some can be up to 10 or 12. Mirrorless cameras have a pretty ridiculous number of shots you can get out of it.
Up to 120.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, so at that point, you're just shooting a movie and pulling frames out of it. So frames per second really matter in wildlife. You can do it without burst mode, but you're getting one shot, literally one shot to get the shot. What that also means is you have to do a lot of culling, folks. When you're doing your post-production, I can end a good birding day with 2,000 shots. And if I don't go home and my first sweep be to download everything and then flag all the pictures I want to keep and jettison everything else and then start processing the ones I kept. I never keep more than 10% of what I shoot. And ultimately, by the time I'm done editing and post-processing, I'm probably keeping 2% of what I shoot. You have to be able to let go. If you're a hoarder and you want to keep every single shot, you need some big hard drives. And you are going to spend a long time in post-production. So that's my number one rule, is learning to just ruthlessly cull and throw things out. Because when you're shooting at a high frame rate, out of my 20 pictures of that mama feeding a baby hummingbird, 2/3 of them are going to look very similar, right? It's just a tilt of a head or a little bit of a, which way is its head, angles of beaks. And it's just so helpful to get to the point where you can distill it down to the shots that are unique and really matter. It also really helps all your friends and family when you share your photos. If you're sharing 2, 3, 5, and not 200. Because I probably want to see all 200 of your hummingbird photos, but most people do not. And they don't have much patience for it. So choosing what to share and how to share it, and even just saving yourself the post-processing time. Anything that's blurry, anything that's got a bad background, anything that's got branches blocking it, I'm throwing before I even process it. And that's an important part of being able to shoot and not tie yourself up in front of a computer forever and ever and ever. The other thing is your memory card speed. It took me a long time to figure out that was a super important piece of the puzzle. Did you guys know that? So when you're shooting in burst mode, you get the dreaded buffering. So you're shooting, right? I'm shooting and here. Let me give you an example. All right, so if I was just holding down my shutter, that's every one of those is a picture. Notice how long I can go, right? So these are all pictures that are being taken. With my older camera or with memory that didn't read and write as fast, I would be in the middle of this amazing action-packed moment. And my button would be pressed down, I'd be tracking it, I'd be a pro at this. And then all of a sudden it would stop making noise. And it's because the buffer was trying to write all those photos to the drive. And so my buffer was full and the drive wasn't writing fast enough. And so I was just dead in the water until the buffer cleared and I could keep shooting again. So the faster your memory card speed, if you're gonna shoot in burst mode, the more of a chance you have to shoot a lot of pictures, maybe even indefinitely, before your buffer fills up. And at that moment where you want to capture, the 300 pictures in the 4-minute series that is really important to you, you don't want to hit buffering if you can help it. They cost more, and some cameras are only going to accept something up to a certain level. So you have to buy for what you're shooting with. But the highest level you can get on read-write speed is what you want if you want to shoot in burst mode. Whatever is the highest you can afford and that your camera will take, try to hit that. It's also a balance of how big a card do you want. I only shoot with a 64 gig because I'm going to download every day. And so, after every major session, I'm going to download and clear that card. So I don't need a gianter or bigger card. I can spend my money on the higher read-write point than the bigger card because of the way that I'm going to use my cards. So just food for thought. If you're slowing down, if burst mode is getting you and you're buffering, your memory card speed might be what's getting you. All right, so field techniques, right? There's no way you're going to get these shots if you're not practicing. And locking on that target is so hard. Going from I see the thing with my eyeballs to I can immediately get it in focus on my camera is a skill that takes so much practice. And it's just muscle memory. There's no way around it. There's no shortcut. Do you guys have any shortcuts, or is it, yeah, no? Practice.
The one thing that I found is, number one, I get so excited when I see something. Right?
Yep.
Just going, is I preset my camera for what I think the settings that I am going to use before I even leave the house.
Yes. Always good to have your sort of middle of the road, good motion settings in place. And that's always what you roll back to after you make changes. I have definitely forgotten to roll back to my tried and true settings, and it has been a huge problem. So yeah, that's a great one. But just there's no substitute for that spotting to locking your camera on the target other than practice. And you're going to have to do it a lot. There's no shortcut for that. So make that a point of practice. Tracking motion is another one, right? So you've got the bird that's flying across, being able to track it with your camera and keep the focus as it goes is a very practiced skill. It's one that you've got to do over and over and over again. Bigger birds are easier. My kingfisher regularly challenges me to nail it, and I often fail. It's gotta happen. That's why some people like to use tripods. They make me crazy. I don't have enough control. I'd much rather be moving my body than trying to figure out how to move my gimbal head and all of that. It's really what you get used to, is a lot of it. And so to develop these skills, to practice them, you got to find some willing victims. Where I live, gulls are everywhere. They're big, they're lumbering, their motion is predictable. You could use doves here. They're good targets. They're going to move in a way, they're going to track in a way that is going to be pretty reasonable for you to get a camera focus on it and then track it as it's moving. It's always easier to track something that is parallel to you than something that is perpendicular coming at you. That change of focus is so fast when they're heading toward you that it's really hard to get the adjusted focus well. And then a little bit about toys, right? So it's not so much what you're shooting with, it's what settings are you using, what techniques have you mastered, and how much patience do you have. Your gear is always going to be your gear. You can upgrade it. That's great. But at the end of the day, it's one piece of the puzzle. And there's a lot you can do with any camera. The adage is absolutely true. The best camera you have is the one that's with you. And my iPhone has definitely gotten a workout at times when I haven't had my big camera with me, right? Because sometimes I can get the shot. Or even just getting the really small shot that isn't great was enough for me to ID a new bird, which is really exciting. Use what's with you and get comfortable with it and get happy with it. If you can upgrade, one of the things you can do is you can try it before you buy. There's a lot of companies that will let you rent gear so that you can add it to your collection, work with it, try it, see how it feels. I might have bought that 300 lens if I hadn't rented it and been like, yeah, this isn't that much more than what I already have with my 150. I didn't feel like I was getting enough to make it worth investing in a whole nother lens. But as soon as I rented that 600, I was like, this is it. I'm sold. Same thing with macro. I would love to buy a macro lens to explore that side of photography. I just haven't really carved out the time yet, and I'm not ready for it. But when I do, I'm definitely going to rent one first and find the macro that's the right fit for me, for my price point, and with my gear. The other thing to consider is that monster lenses are not mobile. They're big and they're heavy. As Dave and I were talking about, mirrorless is one answer to that. So mirrorless cameras are really the future. We're all going to be heading that way eventually. Those of us with DSLRs, especially if you want the more pro line or carting around big, heavy, 8-pound commitments. So handheld is, it's a freedom that I love. I'm glad that the lens that I chose allows for it. Big lenses like the 600 primes, I hear don't do as well handheld. I've never gotten to play with one. So if you like to roam around, if you don't want to be as stationary, then you want to weigh what gear you want. That's definitely a set of trade-offs as well. All right, super quick. I'm going to give you some resources. Yep.
You mentioned trying out the macro before buying it.
Yeah.
Why would you buy a macro when you could use a zoom and just step back and zoom in and use it as a macro?
Well, it depends on the kind of macro you want. So I do a lot of that. I do a lot of that kind. I did rent a macro way back when I first started, and it was a really intense macro. Like I needed an actual framed setup to be able to use it because it was getting me a true 10x. So at that point, you're manually focusing. You're really setting it up in such a way that you're getting. I was taking pictures of the pollen, the individual pieces of pollen on my grill cover. It was that close. So it was a level of macro that was like crazy. I had no idea what I was signing up for when I rented it. And it was very cool, but very labor intensive in setting it up. So I do a lot of that kind of shooting with my bigger lens. The one thing about macros that is a little special is those lenses will let you get a lot closer to get things to fill your frame a lot more. Most camera lenses make you step way back, and then you just, at a certain point, you can't zoom in anymore. You can't get any closer. So macros are designed to let you be very close to something and still get a shot. Even your average walk-around lens, you still need, a foot, 18 inches before it'll focus. So macros let you get much closer, and as a result, you get a much more of it will fill your frame at a much tighter zoom.
And I find with my 70 to 300, if I step back far enough, I can zoom in as close as a macro lens will go.
Yeah, no. The other thing macros have is a very shallow depth of field, much more so than the 70 to 300 will allow. So that can make a difference depending on what you're trying to shoot. Different lenses, ring bells for different reasons, and there's lots of workarounds. It's one of the reasons I haven't gotten a macro yet, because I can make do with what I've got. I've got a 18 to 144 that I use for close stuff, and then I've got my 150 to 600 that covers everything else. So yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's getting specialized lenses. It's you're spending money on something that's very specific. I will put these in the PDF for you, but basically I just wanted to make sure you guys had any resources that might help you. These are all birding because birds are everywhere, and that's how we all end up accidentally being bird nerds. There's lots of resources for where you can go birding. There's lots of social media groups like Facebook groups that are specific to your area that would allow you to go do all sorts of fun things. You can use online resources like Cornell's All About Birds or Audubon's Field Guide to learn more about the species that you're seeing.
Do you find that helpful?
Once I know what I'm trying to read more about, yes. Like every now and then we'll be like, where's the behavior? How big are they compared to this other kind of bird? eBird I find more useful because that'll tell me who's where I am at various times of year and what's being seen in my area. So that's a really fun one. And that's based on people tracking their sightings. And then they compile everything and kind of show you what the patterns are. And I do a lot of logging on eBird to just help my community know what birds are in the area. They've got an app, so it's really easy to do on your phone. This is my favorite app. If you don't have Merlin, get Merlin. I would never have become a birder capable of IDing birds if I was relying on a book field guide. I hate the way they're organized. They make me crazy. But Merlin lets you pick your location. It lets you pick your date. It lets you pick a general size of your bird. And then it asks you what colors, up to 3, that you're seeing. And then it asks, what was it doing? And from that information, you get a visual scrolling list of what the bird might be. So whether you took a picture or whether you just saw it and you're trying to remember, all of a sudden you're scrolling and you can be like, that's the bird I want. Sometimes it's tricky because they'll show you the male, but it was actually the female you were seeing. So swipe to take a look at more of the pictures. But this single-handedly changed my life for birding because I was able to start recognizing the most common birds in my area because it was so easy to find them. I would never have been able to do this if I was flipping through 400 pages of a field guide. I couldn't have done it. So this lowered my barrier to entry in a big way. You guys? Mm-hmm?
Also, you take a picture.
Yes, now you can take a picture, it'll guess it for you, and now their sound ID is also really good. I've used other sound ID apps that were terrible. Theirs, you can hit record, and as you're watching it, it'll add new birds to the list, so you get a list of everything you're hearing. And I want to get better at the auditory ID, and I'm terrible at it right now. So I'm hoping that's going to help me get better. The other thing you guys have is there is a birding checklist specifically for your county. So if you want to start checking off what birds are on your life list, what you've seen and what you still want to see, it's out there. And those can be really fun. I made one specifically for our island, which is a subset of, the region that we're in, and islanders love it. It's really fun to have your own special bird list of what people have seen. All right, that's it. Any questions?
What island are you on?
I am on Anderson.